So welcome to all of you who are with us this evening or this afternoon, depending on where you are. Welcome to Pacifica Graduate Institute and Pacifica Online Authors Talk with Richard Frankel and Victor J. Krebs, the authors of an incredible recently released book, Human Virtuality and Digital Life. I'm Laura Lee Scott, Director of Pacifica Online, and I am so happy you're here with us. Let me begin this evening by sharing a little bit about our authors, Richard and Victor, and these are their abbreviated bios. You can find their full bios on our website. Richard Frankel is a faculty member and supervisor at the Massachusetts Institute for Psychoanalysis. He is a teaching associate and supervisor in psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. He is the author of The Adolescent Psyche, Jungian and Winnicottian Perspectives, soon to be republished as part of the Routledge Classic series. He lectures widely and teaches seminars on comparative psychoanalysis, Winnicott, Bion, dreams, and the interface of continental philosophy and psychoanalytic thought. Victor Krebs is professor of philosophy in the Department of Humanities at the Pontifical Catholic University of Peru and philosophical curator at VJK Curaduría Filosófica. He has written on philosophy of language, technology, psychoanalysis, aesthetics, cinema, and popular culture. He's also the author of The Pornographic Imagination Against Skepticism in Culture, The Recovery of Meaning, Wittgenstein, Philosophy and the Transcendent, and Of the Soul and Art, Reflections on Image, Culture, and Memory. So welcome, Victor and Richard, and thank you for this conversation.
Thank you for the invitation. We're very happy to be here.
Very happy to be here, yeah.
Well, we're thrilled to have you here. So before we dive into our questions this evening, I think we have to start with a huge congratulations to both of you, because it was announced, I don't know if it was announced today, but it was the first time that I saw it, that your book has just been nominated for a Gradiva Award.
Yes, we saw that announcement too. Very exciting.
So congratulations. That's very
you.
Synchronistic that came out today, and we're going to be talking about your work. So before we get into the more esoteric themes in your book, I like to start with the backstory, the personal story. So let's start with the two of you. Victor, a philosophy professor in Peru. Richard, a faculty member and supervisor at Harvard Medical School. How did the two of you meet, and how did the idea for collaborating on this book come about?
Richard? Okay. We actually both attended the same undergraduate school. We went to Vanderbilt University, and we met there. And I think over the course of a 30+ year friendship, we have been sort of discussing the issues of technology as we sort of together experienced the technological changes that were happening over the years. And both of us were very interested in those changes and very struck by them. For example, I remember one Christmas party we attended together where someone out of the blue brought a video camera, which we had never seen a video camera before, and started to interview and record the people in the room. And we ended up, each of us, talking on that camera about our feelings about video cameras and the fact of the intrusion of being recorded and what it meant. So those conversations really started to open up spontaneously between us for many, many years before we decided to start to write a book.
And we read, I mean, I think we instructed each other. Richard was studying psychoanalysis and doing social work and so on and so forth. And I was studying philosophy. And so we brought books that we found interesting and we shared them. And I got my archetypal psychology formation reading books with Richard, and we read Heidegger on technology and McLuhan on. So we were really just sharing knowledge that we were getting from our different fields and relating it to what we were experiencing. And I think it became clear to us that there was an issue, topics there that we wanted to talk about very recently, about 10 years ago in a 30-year conversation. And we started to deliver papers in different congresses and colloquia. And then one afternoon we were working, I think, on a paper or something like that, and we heard that Richard's editor from Routledge was in town. And so we decided from one moment to the next to just write a proposal. And I think we wrote the proposal in 2 days, right? And sent it to her, and she immediately responded positively. So that's where it all started.
Yeah.
Wow. So if I'm understanding you, I mean, you go back over 30 years. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah, we believe we find it unbelievable too.
That's amazing. I mean, what an incredible friendship on so many levels. And so this book, like that saying always goes, the overnight success. I mean, this book was actually 30 years in the making then.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
It took us like, what, 6 years, really, no?
Yeah.
To from the moment we proposed it to the moment we delivered it, about 6 years. It was,
Wow.
it was long labor.
Wow. Well, I will tell you that, maybe that's why it reads like this. For those of you listening, I mean, I haven't been this excited about a book in a while. If you have not yet gotten this book, I am unabashedly promoting it. It's really an amazing, amazing read. And it's such a cross-pollination of the psychoanalytic and the philosophical, which is the two of you, which is what you both bring to it. So thank you. All right. So thank you for giving us that backstory. I won't ask you to tell the stories I'm sure you must have on each other. That'll be for another interview, another time. But let's go into our question. So in the preface of your book, you share an incredible description of what the process of writing this book in 2 separate countries was like. Victor in Peru, Richard in Boston. And there's many of us who are spending so much time on screen, and we're all lamenting the lack of embodied presence. But you suggest something that I really hadn't thought about till I read it. You talk about a virtual melding of psyche and voice because of that digital collaboration. So let me read just an excerpt from your book, because I want people who might not have read it yet to hear the writing. And then I'd love to hear your thoughts on that process of that melding of psyche and voice in the writing process. You write this: "It felt, in fact, as if something beyond our individual minds started constellating. Alive in the strange presence of our digital images on the screen, sometimes blurred and then again sharply clear, sometimes glitching or trailing behind our words, garbling sounds that echoed or muted themselves, our bodies were routinely reconstituted into virtual selves. Welded together in the virtual page at the pace and rhythm of our tapping keys, our hands would blend our words together into a single flow. When we had the opportunity to write in the same physical location, whether that was in Lima or in Boston, dealing with the hard realities of our material lives, the contrast with working in our usual shared digital mind space was poignant. On those occasions, even though we were present together, ironically enough, we felt more separate." So can the two of you maybe comment about that? Talk about that.
It was a very interesting experience. We didn't know we couldn't anticipate something like that. But what we discovered in working through Skype, we were both on Skype and with a text on our side that we could work together on. We started to discover that we created a space where, in fact, the positions we assumed, sometimes we switched without noticing, and we experienced that phenomenon that I think Jung calls an antiodromia, right? Where suddenly you adopt the other person's, the opposite position as yours. And Richard and I had always been a little bit kind of polarized with regard to technology. I mean, we could say, to exaggerate terms, that Richard was sort of technophobic and I was technophilic, and eventually during those conversations, suddenly I was a technophobic and he was technophilic, and this is essential to what we discovered in writing about technology, namely that precisely that play between these two poles is essential to the integral nature of technology, and that holding that tension was what made us able to move beyond just partialized perspectives on it. And I think that was, but with regard to your question, I just want to add one more thing, and that is that we were so engaged in the virtual experience of ourselves kind of melding together and working together. Sometimes we would be working on a paragraph together, and I had an idea and Richard had his own idea, and we took the paragraphs away and then we came back. And what was amazing was we would read the paragraphs to each other, and we were saying the same things, but from different perspectives, from a psychoanalytic. So that was also a discovery. And so we were discovering the virtual melding of ourselves. And then what we described afterwards when we got together physically was that we realized that melding of the selves that was so easy then, that was somehow shielded from the physical presence of the other, made us realize how difficult the physical presence of the other was without that filter. And so you're right. I mean, most of us in our virtual experience complain about not being physically present. But what we discovered was the reverse. We discovered first the wonderful melding of virtual and physical, and this has a lot to do with, I think, what eventually we develop in the book about the notion of the virtual, because we have this tendency of thinking of the virtual as something that's a copy of the real, right? I mean, a very Platonic way of understanding the virtual. What we were discovering there, I think, was that the virtual and the physical, the empirical and the virtual, are always together. They cannot be separated. And then the virtual is an extension of our body, not a substitute to or an alternative, possibly upgraded version of it.
Yeah. And I was thinking that I think that the experience that we're discussing, that difference in feeling between being virtually connected versus being embodied with someone, for people who are practicing psychotherapy today in kind of virtual ways using telehealth, versus being in the room with a patient, I think that's a play space to understand something of this difference. The first time I had this experience was pre-pandemic, where I had a client who was late for a session. So this is when we actually used to see people in person, if anybody can remember those times. The client was late for a session and got on their cell phone and said, well, I don't want to waste time. I'm going to call you and let's start the session as I'm driving. So, right, today this is so routine, but back then it was sort of a very novel thing. And so we're talking on the phone and we're getting into some issues and there's a real connection happening. And then all of a sudden, to my surprise, I hear a knock on my door and I open the door and there's the patient. And that contrast between what we were doing in a virtual space and their physical presence was so startling to me. That I think it's a little bit similar to what Victor's describing happened, the difference in writing the book from when we work together in a virtual space versus actually sitting down together in the same country, in the same room. And I think there's a way today that Zoom and telehealth has become so normalized that startle that I had, that apperception of that difference, I think we don't notice it anymore, or it gets harder to notice. I mean, the rare time that you might notice it today is where you start with a patient on Zoom and you get to know them on Zoom and you do a lot of work on Zoom. And then for some reason, they come into your office and you have a session. There's where you can start to feel that again, that difference. But I think it's a very important one to understand and study. I think we try to really work that out in the book in whatever ways we can.
So already I'm going off script with both of you, but so because listening to both of you describe this, I'm fascinated. I mean, what do you think happens what do you think is actually happening when that embodied self is almost an intrusion that kind of interrupts that space? What is that?
Well, the first thing is just the presence, the physical presence of the other person affects you in ways that you're not affected by in the screen. I mean, it's just a different, equally complicated relationship. It's just that the contrast makes you kind of you're startled by it because there's a big contrast. But then if you think about it, they're just two aspects of the same interaction, except one is happening in the virtual and the other one is happening in the spatial. And I think that it's just a difference. And it seems to me that we tend to want to compare and see what is better or what we're missing that is irreplaceable. And I think that that's the wrong way of thinking about what we're experiencing, that we're experiencing an extension of ourselves. And that extension means that we're melding into a virtual. And so this imposes different parameters in our understanding of each other, in our communication, and the kinds of things that count, the other things that don't count. And so the difficulty is just that this is new to us, and the other in contrast becomes strange. I don't know. We haven't really talked about this specific point so much, Richard, but right. I mean, I've been thinking about this lately in that way.
And perhaps it's analogous to the experience of being inside a very intense dream, right? Which you might say is a kind of a dream is sort of a virtual, very akin to a virtual space, where there's possibility, where there's imagination, where anything can happen. And then suddenly being awakened from that dream and feeling the emotions of the dream in your body in the middle of the night, in the darkness of the night, feeling how that dream sits in your body. Something about, again, there's a difference there. There's a difference in the experience of the dream from being inside it to waking up from it. Both of them very essential, and both of them very poignant. But again, that trying to notice what that difference is, I think we're trying to talk about today.
Yeah. Well, thank you both for that. So in the introduction to your book, you address a consideration that I think is critical to your work. You write that you have centered the concept of the virtual as, quote, the fulcrum of your entire exploration. But then you go on to challenge the assumption that I think your readers might make with regards to what exactly the virtual is. You write this: it is precisely that unquestioned belief in the radical separateness of real and virtual that needs to be contested. The virtual should be understood not as an illusory artificial reality, but as the dimension of possibility inherent to all reality. And a bit further on, you describe it this way when you write, what we are dealing with in the book then is not primarily virtual reality in the digital sense, but the reality of virtuality. So I read that and I went back and reread that and underlined that and just like have been chewing on that ever since. So I'd love to hear both of you talk to us about that, because I know for me, my mind just goes immediately to, oh yeah, virtual reality. And I see it as a somewhat deficient caricature of the real. But you're challenging us to say, and to lean into this idea of the potentiality and the possibility inherent to all reality. So I want, feel free to talk to us about that concept.
Start us off, Victor.
This is the typical assumption, right? And virtuality comes alive to us in virtual and digital virtuality. But what we try to argue in the book is that virtuality is an essential component of what being human is, and that the first virtual space that we inhabit is a space that opens up in the mind, in language and image, and that the history of humanity, and which is at the same time the history of technology, is nothing other than are learning ways to modulate that space, that mental space, which is atemporal, which is infinite. It's full of possibilities. I mean, in our imagination, in our concepts, we are able to sort of, in a way, capture the world in an atemporal and infinite space. And that allows us to, change the world, to construct tools, to transform it, and so on and so forth. And so one could think of virtuality as something that has been with us from the moment we were conscious, and every new technology is a way of modulating that. And so we modulate it, for instance, first with words, then with written words. And so we have the virtual now is on the page. Then we take pictures, and the virtual becomes a photograph that we work with, we play with, or we draw it. And so and the digital is just the latest modulation of that virtuality that we all have. And so I think that the important point here is that virtuality is intrinsic to human beings. It's not something external to us. And so that the modulation, the technological modulation of that virtual space, of those possibilities, that is something that we're dealing with always and have been always. And so the digital is just the latest with its own particularities, but it's exactly the same issues that are going to come up, the way in which we sort of confront death and we try to avoid it, and so on and so forth. No?
Yeah, and I would just add, then maybe from a psychological perspective, we might say that all of the psychological theorists that we start to explore in the book have an implicit concept of the virtual. So in Freud and Jung, it's when they talk about psychic reality or psychical reality, they're talking about a kind of virtual space. We do a lot of work in the book with Winnicott, where potential space really feels like this space of possibility that we're trying to achieve, that somewhere between reality and fantasy, or holding the tension of reality and fantasy in potential space arises. In Bion's work, it's his concept of the O, this kind of force outside of us that moves through us. You could think of as a kind of virtuality that arises. And so much of psychotherapy, psychoanalysis, whatever way we want to talk about it, is about how you open up virtual spaces with the patient. I mean, dream, fantasy, imagination is about allowing these potential spaces in the room. And we keep trying to make the distinction that the virtual is not the actual. That's the difference. Right? There's a distinction between the virtual and the actual, and that gets very confused. And I think in the book, we sort of really try to tease those distinctions apart to make that clear, to open up the virtual as its own space. And we use a lot of philosophy and psychoanalysis to do that.
Right. Deleuze has a famous phrase where he says that the actual is not, well, actually, Pierre Levy first formulates it this way. He says that it's not a contraposition between reality and virtuality, but between virtuality and actuality, because virtuality is already part of reality. Or in other words, that the virtual is real even before it's actual. Our psychic image.
Really so are you talking about the virtual as the potentiality that is in an inherent possibility of reality, but may or may not emerge, right? And so
yes,
but that we have the capacity, because we are beings that can abstract from reality into this space of virtuality, right? That we're the only ones that really can make that possibility, the possibilities of reality, an object that we can work on, that we can, forge, that we can bring something out of.
And then one of the complications about how the virtual manifests as virtual reality is, what does it mean then for us to have these new tools that allows the space of emergence to be concretized instantly at our fingertips? Because we often in the book try to make the distinction between the kind of emergence that arises with psychic reality, right? Where things sort of move through us and come to us with a certain kind of autonomy and otherness, versus the way that emergence happens in virtual reality, which feels sometimes like it has a lot more to do with the ego being in control. It has a certain tinge of narcissism to it. Not always. I mean, but we're trying to explore those gradations of differences between those two realms. And there's something both potentially exciting and important about virtual reality as this new medium in which we can learn to play in, and also something very dangerous about it. And that's another tension that we're always trying to hold in the book.
Yeah. Fascinating. All right, so let's go on to another paradigm shattering challenge you give us as readers in your book, is to, and that's kind of where you were just going with this, Richard, is to resist the urge to either romanticize the limitless advances of digital technology or demonize our infatuation with it as regressive and symptomatic. And then you go on to offer something you refer to, or you bring forward for us, of the pharmacon, and encouraging your readers to hold the tension of a seeming paradox when you write this: Perhaps it is our very human inclination for closure, as well as an implicit need to preserve a single foundational substance, that makes it difficult to live in this tension. Instead of holding it, we polarize and either fantasize optimistically about digital eternity fleeing from bodily weight, or battle skeptically and tragically against the digital, which we see as a fever raging in our time and numbing us to life. So can you tell us more about this idea of the pharmacon and how this applies to helping us hold the tension that you're talking about? Who wants to go first? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I would start by talking about the pharmacological attitude, which I think is a central issue in the book, how it is that we have to deal with technology. And I just want to start with a concept that I bring from philosophy, Ortega-Gasset, that we've been working on from the very beginning. Ortega-Gasset talks about as ontological centaurs, meaning by that we are made of two incompatible natures, that we are a paradox, that we ourselves are a paradox, and that there is a resistance from the virtual to the limitations of the material of the body. And that this is a tension that plays with the pharmacon. The pharmacon can be poisonous or can be a remedy, depending on how we use a dosage, how we manage these, or hold the tension, we could say. Right. So what we're trying to show with the pharmacological attitude is that the whole point of it is to hold attention, because this paradox is intrinsic to us. And this same paradox is extended to technology. Technology is an expression of ourselves and also as a means to manipulate that expression of ourselves. So in a way, technology becomes, as it were, the tool through which we can manage correctly or incorrectly, positively or negatively, efficiently or non-efficiently, that pharmacon that we are.
And as we were researching the book, it was as if we could take, we read a lot of books about technology and a lot of commentary on technology. And it was as if we could take those books and line them up on our bookshelves on the pro side, where technology is liberatory and going to save us, and the negative side, where it's seen as the destruction and end of mankind. And we really felt that the discussions about technology, when we would present our stuff, immediately would polarize into those two positions. And we really tried to, as we were writing, state really what Jung does talk about in terms of holding the tension. Something happens when you can hold the tension of the good and the bad in some new way of entering it. I think that was the spirit that we wrote about the book. I was thinking one way that this really manifested for me was during the pandemic, when all of a sudden, sort of in the blink of an eye, the community that I'm in of psychoanalysts and therapists immediately turned to doing all of their practice for about a year on Zoom. You remember that terrible moment when just like that, we were all on Zoom. And so we had communications with each other going, and it was amazing how that same kind of polarization happened with the question of telehealth. Half the community said, this is absolutely abominable. I'm missing the physical presence of the patient. There's no real work that's happening. This is superficial. And the other half of my community said, things are opening up in this new space that have never opened up before in all of my years of practice with people. People are talking in different ways. People are telling me things. There's a level of, but there was no attempt to sort of really try to hold both those things that were happening at once, and to think into that difference again. So it just try to notice when you talk about technology with people, that splitting that occurs. It's so basic to us.
Yeah,
and I'm wondering, Richard, and if now that people have the freedom to go back to meeting in person, I don't know what your experience is, but I know that the analysts and therapists that I'm talking with, they've gone back to meeting in person with some of their clients, but not with all of them. I mean, there's, that telehealth isn't just disappeared. That's become a permanent part of their practice now.
No, absolutely. I mean, it's Pandora's box. I mean, the genie is out of the bottle. And once people get a taste of the convenience and freedom of not having to drive their car into the city and come into the therapist's office, a lot of people don't want to give that up. And for a lot of patients, there's something about virtual contact that they prefer. Now, we could talk about that in a lot of complicated ways. What's defensive about that? What's helpful about that? But again, it's a real mix of things. And really, yeah.
I would say that this has to do precisely with what we were talking about before, that if we see this as an extension of the possibilities that become available in our communication with the other, there is no reason why we could not consider this virtual side or aspect of the analytical relation as bringing something in that wasn't there, that may be more important in certain stages or for certain people than the other. So we tend to always start to compare one with the other instead of seeing this as an integral whole that is moving in a direction that we're unfamiliar with. And so I think this is what I consider to be the center of the pharmacological attitude. Now, there was a question in the chat that I think we need to respond to, and that's pharmakon is the name the Greeks gave to anything that was both at the same time a poison and a remedy. Right? It could be that had that potential, that it was its potential to have that ambivalence, and that it's being poisonous or it's being remedial or curative depended on how it was that we managed that tension, how we held it, in what ways. And one could say that the reason why digitality, the virtual, can seem to be such a horrible thing is because we're polarizing it. We're not seeing it as part of a pharmacon where we have to find the way in which to hold attention rather than eliminate the tension. And I've been working with this student in philosophy on the metaverse. He's been writing a thesis on the metaverse. So I've been getting a lot of information about this. And it seems to me that the metaverse is the epitome of precisely that dualistic kind of separatist conception of the virtual that sees it as a possibility of replacing and improving reality, when really what the pharmacological shows you is that ambivalence is essential to technology, because technology is nothing but an extension of our very selves.
Right.
Fascinating. All right, so let's keep moving. Let's see, how far along are we on these questions? Okay, so we're going to go with this next question a little bit more towards the psychoanalytic intersections of virtuality and the digital world, where you write this: if for Jung, modern man searched for his soul in the interior chambers of the individual psyche, today, as inhabitants of the digital era, we turn outward toward the collective psyche to discover our depths. We live less inside ourselves and our own bodies and more in the virtualized spaces that arise out of the interchange between smartphones, social media networks, and the internet of everything that connects them. And then you go on to write about how the immediacy of answers that is now available to all of us via Google search and Ask Alexa and Siri affects both the patient and the therapist with what you refer to as, quote, chronic impatience. So I think I was born with chronic impatience, but I think maybe that's exacerbated by this. So can you talk to us a little bit about what you mean by chronic impatience and what's your antidote? Is there an antidote to that?
The first part of that question is easier than the second, no doubt. But maybe one way to talk about it, maybe I could talk about it from a therapeutic perspective, is, that concept of beyonds, that is, I think, one of Beyond's great contributions that he takes from Keats, which is negative capability, the ability to tolerate uncertainty, mystery, and doubt without a kind of irritable reaching after fact and reason. That's his precise definition of it. You could say that the internet and the availability of information and the instantaneity of information works really against cultivating negative capability. And one of the ways that therapy really works, and where things can start to change for a person, is where they're able to tolerate sitting with uncertainty and doubt and allowing something from the psyche to arise of its own accord, not knowing instantly what it means, right? What we might call emergence. And that space today in a digital, because I think of the digital world, gets so easily collapsed in our practice. People want to know what the symptom means instantly. They want to, I mean, the whole fantasy of what relationship the patient has to the iPhone that they bring into the session, and the way that the iPhone becomes the third in the session, where they want to show you things on it, they want to consult it for information. There's a lot of demand then for the therapist to sort of become like a Google search, like the therapist becomes more and more than that old trope of kind of a certain kind of expert that has to sort of say precise things in the moment for the patient in the way as if they're typing something into Google. And you can see why certain kinds of robotic therapies are very attractive to people, right? Do you even need a human being anymore to do therapy? It opens up those kinds of questions. So that's the negative side of it. I think Victor might be able to say something more positive there.
Well, I don't know if more positive, but I think that, well, first of all, the negative capability has to do with time, with space, with silence. And that's precisely what is done away with in a medium that is being used merely for information. Information is quick, transparent. Byung-Chul Han, I don't know if you know him, he's a Korean, South Korean German philosopher who writes very, very good short books that really give you ideas in little pills. And this is one idea that I think he does very well at explaining. He says, the informational age, the medium of information is speedy. It works transparently. And it has, he says, the metaphysics of contingency. It's the present moment. It's what passes like this. And so this is something that was anticipated even by Baudrillard 40 years ago, right? When he said that the speed, he was already speaking of the speed at which our society was moving, had done away with all the powers and virtues of the soul and left only two, indifference and impatience. And I think that this is what we're seeing exacerbated by the fact that we are using Google for information and not for real transformation knowledge, which is what supposedly you do with a patient or with a student, really, in exchanging information. And just to note this is something that was noted by Plato when they started talking about the invention of writing, that this would have the same effect, that people will start to memorize words and not do the work of memory that he said one needed to do, the internal transformation of what you're learning. So this, I think, is a let's say a peril that all technologies have. This is not specific to digitality. It just may be a little bit more intense, and but it doesn't go to the essence of the digital, but rather to the use, the bad use that we're making of it.
Yeah, I mean, this is fascinating as I'm listening to you, and I think that word emergence. I mean, I think so many of us, I know I'm guilty of this. We love that word transformation, and we throw it around so easily. But transformation takes an inordinate amount of time and generally suffering are necessary components. And so as I'm listening to both of you, what was coming to my mind was and what you just said, Victor, about it's not the technology, it's our orientation towards the technology, right? So I asked that question, well, what's the antidote to that? What's coming to the forefront for me listening to both of you is the orientation of the artist. Because a creative understands that in order to create, it takes time. It's not an egoic, I'm just going to go into the studio and dial up what I want to create. When you really listen to great artists or you read about them, there is this sense of, I'm midwifing something that wants to be born. And that's going to take time, and it's going to be messy, and it's going to probably be painful, and it's not going to fit into my agenda. I'm needing to surrender to that, right? So how do we cultivate that kind of orientation in this digital world would be my question for both of you.
Well, that is the hard question. I mean, how is it that how does a pharmacological attitude translate into something that effectively does away with this speed that runs over any possibility of reflection? I think it needs. I mean, I think of something so prosaic as strategies in one's own life. I mean, because first of all, there's the issue of the collective use of technology that now is, it's subordinated to powers that are financial, economic, and so on and so forth. Nothing to do with the flourishing of human beings. It has to do with money. That being said, the peril there is obvious. The temporality of the digital media goes against the temporality needed for psychic transformation or psychic growth. So we need to take arms in a different way than collectively in the digital, but personally first of all. And so you need to start saving spaces where you protect yourself from that influence. It seems to me that disciplines of various sorts are necessary. But to start with, it's the awareness of how this really is undermining the possibility of that dimension of human being from evolving, and so it's an issue. I mean, I don't have an answer to it, but I think in my personal life, how do I deal with it? I mean, I'm thinking about this. I mean, there has to be some effective, practical consequence to this, and I think it is the awareness of being alert to how it is affecting me, how it's not allowing me to sit down and read. I mean, how many of us are having that difficulty of sitting down to read? I mean, I have read all my life that I'm a philosopher, but I read 3 pages and I'm like desperate to move somewhere else. And you go, wow, I got to really tone down on my digital use.
I guess I had a little anecdote, just again, like there's not a simple answer to this, obviously, but all we can do is give little images. But I was thinking with my 18-year-old son, when we get into a discussion about something and things start to get a little bit deeper and a little bit heated between us, even if we're not seeing things exactly the same, his impulse is to pull out his phone and to then search whatever we're talking about so he can prove to me through the internet that that his position is right and my position is wrong. So I started to tease him, and we started to name that the epistemological impulse. That pulling out the phone is the epistemological impulse. And so not just even having that playful image is a way that tempers that when we start to talk about something, he starts to notice that tendency to want to go to the phone and what it both can open up and what it forecloses in the conversation. Not that he doesn't still sometimes go to the phone, but something's shifted a little bit just by naming it together. So I think it has to be in those small ways.
Yeah. I think you're both bringing up some important points. I mean, I love what Victor's saying about discipline, self-awareness, and bringing a disciplined awareness to, and what you're saying about bringing in some humor into that as well, to be able to hold that tension. Yeah.
And
That's
dancing
important.
certainly does help.
Yeah. Okay, so moving along, we've got a few more questions, and then we will be opening it up to those of you who are on with us. So feel free to be making notes of questions or comments as we move through this conversation. But you write further along in your book that there is a, quote, deeply buried narcissistic wound that is at the core of what could be called the digital unconscious. So you need to unpack that a little bit for us, okay? What, the digital unconscious, and then what is this deeply buried narcissistic wound that's at its core?
Yeah. Whew, that's a big one. To say a couple of things out of it. I mean, if we think a little bit psychoanalytically, we would say that the formation of the self always comes out of something that happens to our narcissism over time through development. In the way that we have to suffer something about a loss of a narcissism. Winnicott would call it a loss of omnipotence that happens. He would talk about this move from object relating to object usage, where you have to then take into the reality, the separate subjectivity of the other person, where the other person is no longer just an extension of yourself. So all of us developmentally have had to go through some process of suffering that. And depending on what happened in our development, that can go in myriad of ways. Then technology comes along that allows for a certain way of regaining a kind of narcissistic orientation to the world. There's some basic narcissistic impulse that's always embedded in our use of technology in terms of the way that it so powerfully magnifies the self, puts us at the center of everything, and again, floods us with that very early feeling of omnipotence. So that's what we're talking about. The narcissistic wound has something to do with beginning to become conscious of the narcissistic uses that we turn to with our technologies, that I think is a very painful thing to see, and often very hidden in the ways that we engage in the technological or digital world. There's such a powerful magnification of narcissism, and it's a very difficult thing to see that it's often in the shadows. And I think comes out of this wounded place. That's packing a lot in, I know, but.
Yeah, it is probably one of the most difficult questions in the book. I mean, this digital unconscious that we called it. The book was going to be called The Digital Unconscious at some point. It had several titles. That was one of them, and we shed it because obviously it brings all of these questions that still need to be thought on. But let me just approach it from a different perspective. I mean, not from so much a psychoanalytic as let me use a myth that Stiegler uses, the myth of Epimetheus and Prometheus. You know, Prometheus who steals the fire from the gods. But the detail that I think is important for this has to do with the fact that Epimetheus was responsible for providing the faculties and powers to all the creatures. And he divided them amongst all the creatures. And when it came time for human beings, he had none left. And so it was this existential precariousness of human beings that takes Prometheus to steal the fire from the gods and gives it to. So technology is given to us as a compensation from that precariousness. So the digital unconscious has to do with that dynamic between being precarious and having the power of the gods to compensate for that. And so every time that narcissistic wound for me is equivalent also to the fact that we're always losing. Everything is being lost. We're in temporal beings, and so we're mortal beings. And so mortality is with us all the time. And so in order to deal with that wound, that lack that we have at the center of our being, technology has the power to overcome it, and therefore inflates us with hubris. And that hubris is what ultimately is a manifestation of that in technology, of that impulse, that unconscious impulse to deny precisely that which we have to confront and come to terms with. And so in a sense, digital technology, the digital unconscious has to do with this element in technology that leads us back to that sense of omnipotence that we were talking about, and forgetfulness of our wound, of our lack, of our precariousness.
This is deep stuff. So hold on, everyone. This is just kind of the appetizer, right? So we will go. You'll have an opportunity to go in depth into this, because I'm still wrestling and sitting with this whole concept of the digital unconscious as well, even after having read your book. Okay, so getting to moving on to another question. You write, in our everyday use of digital devices, the distinctions between adaptive and pathological instances of dissociation become even more blurred. So can you describe, what you mean by adaptive dissociation? And later on in that same chapter where you write about the play of acknowledgement and disavowal, and how might our relationships with the digital world help with regards to this? So the distinction between adaptive and pathological instances of dissociation relative to the digital.
Yeah, I mean, I think we take this concept right from the great Philip Bromberg, who I think is the best contemporary writer on the phenomenon of dissociation, an amazing guide for therapists to read his work. But he has the idea that, of course, there is an everyday dissociation that's going on all the time that's adaptive, that in order to sort of immerse yourself in one kind of activity, there's a way that you have to tune things out in order to allow that immersion to happen. And that's going on all the time when we think, when we create, when we're in therapy with people, right? That's creative, adaptive dissociation. And then there's pathological dissociation, he says, where you're actually beginning to split things off, a dissociation that needs to make cuts and needs to disavow aspects of reality. Now, the tricky thing about the digital, of course, is that it promotes both kinds of dissociation. There's creative uses of the digital where that first kind of adaptive dissociation, we get immersed in our gadgets, something very creative is happening there, and something very enlivening and life vitalizing. And then, of course, there's the way that people fall into the space of the digital as a way to really block out the real. And that's the kind of way it becomes a sort of solipsistic use that I think is more along the lines of pathological dissociation. Now, the difficulty, of course, is it's very difficult to tell. You look at a group of teenagers and you watch them using their phones and how they relate to each other and how they split off from each other as they go into gadgets and come out of gadgets. It's very hard to know what's pathological dissociation, what's creative dissociation. The digital has this way of sort of really blurring that distinction and make. I mean, I think there's no doubt that we are all living more dissociative lives because we have these gadgets. The nature of that dissociation is what's in question, and how we can begin to analyze that with each other.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned somewhere in the book, and I don't remember the exact numbers, but at what point we will be there'll be a generation that has never not known this
Right.
kind of connection with the screen, right? I mean, I have a 2-year-old grandson, and he's already like fluent with an iPad. You know, I mean, the melding and the seamless interaction at these young ages with that reality is going to blur those lines even more, I think.
Yeah. I would go back and think also about, because of course it's more complicated now that we have these gadgets, but the dissociation is always a part of the adaptive behavior, right? Has always been. I mean, we could be too imaginative and, you know, dreamy and be disconnected from your life all the time. And so you knew that was a sign that there was something going on. We just need to learn the signs also with the digital. I mean, the fact that the lines are blurred is just that we're not familiar with this new environment. The ways in which it can be positive and negative, it requires study. It's not I mean, we know these things in normal interaction because we've had psychoanalysis for 100 years, right? Well, this is a new element that's entering into in the human psyche. We need to figure out how to gauge these modes of dissociation, if they're pathological or not. What are the signs? How can we compensate for that? I think that's the task. I mean, for psychoanalysis, not only to acknowledge the fact that let's say the realm within which psychoanalysis acts has broadened and complexified, but also that all the concepts that we have to be adapted and rethought.
Yeah. So let's go to the last question, and then we will open it up to all of you. So in your chapter, and this is towards the end of the book on digital pharmacology, you write about the 3 blows to narcissism. And then you suggest that AI, artificial intelligence technology, might offer the 4th by ushering in an era of transhumanism. So this was a far out there chapter for me, right? So up until very recently, this was science fiction. It's like, yeah, science fiction is now reality, but you seem to be suggesting that this transhumanism may be the prima materia for an ever evolving consciousness, unless I'm misunderstanding. Can you elaborate a bit on this? And can you first of all just identify the 3 blows to narcissism, and then comment on the AI technology as being the 4th?
I'll take the first half. That three blows to narcissism comes. So my hermetic comes from a very wonderful little paper of Freud's called "A Difficulty in the Path of Psychoanalysis," where he writes that the three blows to narcissism starts with Copernicus, that we are no longer the center of the universe, and then Darwin, that we evolved from animals, right? That's the second blow. And then, of course, Freud in his hubris says that the third blow is given by psychoanalysis, that we are no longer masters in our own house. So that's the third blow to our narcissism that Freud has given us with his new science of psychoanalysis. So I think we're trying to think about how does transhumanism then become the fourth blow to our narcissism? And I'm going to give that to Victor.
Well, I wouldn't put it that way. I would say, first of all, transhumanism is not something that we condone. We are not in agreement with it.
Right.
Transhumanism is another instance, as the metaverse, as an example of it, of dissociating these intrinsically connected dimensions of the virtual and the real. All right, so transhumanism. Transhumanism is that position with regard to what's coming in the next stage, that we're going to be able to download our consciousness, for instance, into a machine, and so it'll be immortal. I mean, this is dualism, total dualism. So that's not something we're espousing at all. It's something that we criticize. But the fourth blow to narcissism is the realization that with artificial intelligence, insofar as it approximates human intelligence and reason, right, it's again showing us that we are not the privileged beings that we were. In that sense, it becomes a blow to our narcissism. Now, that blow to our narcissism has positive consequences. First of all, to in a way displace this idolatry we have on reason. Rationality as being the essential element of human beings, which has led to the oppression of all sorts of other modes of knowledge, as we know from Jung, right? I mean, this has to be recovered. So in that sense, a fourth blow to narcissism that artificial intelligence is responsible for is leading us to a conception of ourselves where reason is not the essential faculty of our nature. And in that sense, it can open up a different horizon for the future, the post-human future, the future of the human reconceived beyond the humanistic hubris, beyond the humanistic anthropocentrism, beyond the humanistic imperialism, racism, colonialism, right? So we're talking about how this fourth blow to narcissism can, in fact, open up, and digitality can help very much in that, open up new roads towards the future of humanity. You're muted, Lorelei.
Oops. This is what happens when I get excited. I become technologically challenged. So I have to ask you this question though on what you just said, Victor, because this transhumanism, while you're saying, I think, you seem to be saying, okay, it opens us up to, or at least deprioritizes this over prioritization of reason, just pure reason as a way of knowing. In my mind, it further elevates reason.
Transhumanism does. No,
yes, as a way of knowing. Oh, okay.
You are correct. I'm not defending. Okay. In fact, I'm saying this is something that fourth blow opens up, completely different from the way the take that transhumanism has of that blow.
Okay.
For transhumanism, transhumanism, that blow means that we are going to be able to enhance ourselves through machines, and so it's not. Let's say it's a potentiation of our sense of omnipotence rather than a degrading of it. And I think that what's positive is a degrading of it.
Right. And so some people make the distinction. It's very important to hold the distinction between the transhumanism, which is this sort of science fiction fantasy, the singularity, downloading our consciousness into machines, and what some people call the post-human condition. And I think we're trying to talk more out of a post-human condition. Like where does it leave man now with the introduction of these new artificial intelligences? But that's a different set of discourses than the transhuman. So I think that was confused.
Yeah. No, thank you for clarifying that. So this is just an amazing conversation. I think those of you who are on with us understand why I'm so excited about the fact that Richard and Victor are going to be offering a 3-week series where you can do a deep dive into not only these concepts, but so many more that are introduced in their book that we don't even have the time to go into. So I'd like us, we have about 25 minutes remaining. I'd love to open this up to those of you who are on with us and give you an opportunity. I know someone's asking a question, Amy. Richard, she was asking about the person you mentioned who was articulating the different kinds of dissociation. I don't know if you remember that.
Yes, that's an author named Philip Bromberg, who's a contemporary psychoanalyst, died about 7 years ago. He's written 3 very good books. One of them is called Standing in the Spaces, but all of his books are about how dissociation occurs in the practice of psychotherapy. And what's so great about his writing is that they're filled with very specific clinical examples. It's very experience near, non-jargony writing that I think really gives you a sense of feeling how important a concept of dissociation is to understanding psychotherapeutic process. Really recommend him.
So is there a link to learn more about that? Yes, there is. So I will tag all that at the end of this, and you will also all be getting emails about the course that's happening in January at the end of this. But I want to give you an opportunity, all of you an opportunity to comment or ask questions. I know it's a lot to take in. Let me lob a question at both of you. This is, again, off script, and I apologize if you don't want to tackle this one, but let me just throw it out there because it's something that I'm sitting with, Jung's emphasis, on this idea of, on soul. We didn't talk about that, and I know you write about it a little bit in the book as well. Can you talk a little bit about how, where does soul fit into this digital, the virtual and the digital, or doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's such an interesting question to think about, the pioneers of depth psychology, Freud and Jung, what they would make of the digital, and what they'd make of the virtual realm, and in some way, if you think about a concept of Jung's like active imagination, dreaming the dream onward, is there a way that being in virtual space and interacting with images in virtual space would be a very creative manifestation of exactly what Jung's talking about? What would he make of virtual reality as compared to, or the potential of virtual reality as compared to psychical reality? Would that be something that felt profound and creative, or would he see a downside in that in some way? I think those are the kinds of questions we're interested in there. What kind of soul making happens in the virtual, to put it in James Hillman's language?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Right.
But we have a chapter, I don't know if you remember it, Laura Lee, where we talk about San Junipero, this episode from Black Mirror, where we coined the notion of the laboratory subjectivity, where the digital can become a laboratory of subjectivity, and I think we're talking there about soul work. I mean, this is what would be involved in such a use of the digital. Right, there would be a psychic work that would enrich your own consciousness. That would have a similar nature as the work that we do in the laboratory, in the patient therapist relation. And I always think, perhaps because it is my own inclination, but in class with my philosophy students, when philosophy starts to do what philosophy is supposed to do, which is not just memorize what other people thought, but rather use it for your own transformation, your own awareness. I think that this can happen in the virtual as much as it can in the real world, which we just have to find the ways in which how it works. So, I mean, there's so many things to say about that, really. I mean, and they're all big questions that need to be sorted out, but it has to do with the fact that we're talking about these concepts that have never had this extension. And it's not a different thing. It's just an extension, I think. And to see that in that, so it makes the questions sort of an opening to new possibilities rather than a rejection of what we have with them.
Anyone else with it? Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Laura Lee. I don't know if I pronounce your name right, but thank you for this talk. I was at I don't know what the technology conference that Stephen Eisenstadt had initiated. Do you remember the title, what it was called, or were you there?
I don't think I was there, Jade, no.
Well, it was very exciting because it sounded like he was also interested, and I'm very passionate about merging depth psychology and humane technology design. So I'm very thankful for the conversation and very excited and wondering how you could implement, concepts of depth psychology in the digital realm. So whoever is interested in that, I would love to be in contact as I'm trying to build something in the technological world that is kind of like an animal guide or like a technological nudging support, in the sense of like, if we see technology as a tool, which I think it ultimately is, and we use it in different ways, it could be a very exciting space. I just think it's being used in the poorest way possible, and in a just really pathetic way. But if there was, if I just see sand play and I see virtual reality, for me, it's probably the first thing I would do in a virtual reality space is to do kind of a Minecraft version, a big sand play, like a big collective sand play, and see what happens there. But I think depth psychology really lends itself as a creative tool for building humane technology. So I'm very thankful for the discussion. Thank you for your insight and for the time you spent with this. It's kind of a very complex, transhuman space is a very complex one, I think, and also working as a therapist, and not wanting to reject or dismiss the embodiment, and just kind of like moving between embodiment and the virtual space, I think is a discussion that's very important, because a lot of my clients are very disembodied at this point and really terrified of intimacy and so on. So I feel like it's a fine dance that we're all dancing. So I really appreciate this. Thank you.
That's very nicely put. Yeah, and it's interesting what happened with child therapy during the pandemic, right? That so many child therapists, in order to continue seeing children, had to do it online. And so much creativity came, and I think exactly what you're saying in terms of how to engage a child in play in a virtual space, that seemed to open up a lot of interesting things that we had never imagined before, and possibilities for connecting and relating through the medium, through a digital medium, that I thought had a lot of usefulness and interest. I supervised a lot of those cases, and I was always quite impressed by the ingenuity of the people who were sort of in there with kids trying to do something out of necessity, of course. It was that or not see the child at all during the worst part of the pandemic.
Yeah, I think the play, we talking about Winnicott, right? How powerful play is, whether it's virtual or it is kind of partly, it happens in the imagination and in the body. So that's what's so magical, right? Like the kind of core human quality is to engage in play. And I think partially that's happening, but then talking to adolescents, on the other hand, I'm working with a couple of people trying to digitally detox, and you have digital literacy. And there it's interesting that all the kids, explain to me kind of like they're looking for connection with others in play. And as long as they're online, there's a kind of illusion of that. But then when they come back to reality, this does not translate into, it's not kind of a soulful process that then they can integrate and bring back into their embodied life. So I think that's also interesting that you have the two opposite, things happening.
Yeah, I mean, the question of the relationship between adolescence and digital technology is such a fruitful, important question. We spend a lot of that time in the book exploring that, especially in our chapter on Winnicott, and trying to use Winnicottian concepts to talk about the possibilities in the digital for adolescents, and also really what the dangers. I mean, the dangers seem pretty obvious.
It's also psychoeducation, right? If kids think that the social media and then the internet are the parents, right? Then you have a second narcissistic wound, that the awakening that there's no parents there after all is pretty painful. So I love that you bring in
exactly
narcissistic wound.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Well, in teaching philosophy, I'm using video games, and I found that to be really important, because not only does it bring the potential that film has, which engages you in ways that, for instance, a book cannot, because of the bodily element, but also the interactive element in the virtual, I think, is very useful if in terms of philosophy, for instance, to incarnate the concepts that we're studying in the actual experience that they're having on the screen in interaction with others. So, I mean, there's really a multitude of possibilities that with creativity one can use the virtual and the digital for those ends.
We got a question from Amy.
I do. I'm finding this absolutely fascinating, because my own work I've been working in the digital realm for over a decade, long before COVID, and working at bringing experiences. I teach online courses and making those spaces online human, bringing our humanity into virtuality, where we tend to think of them as disembodied spaces, when in fact we are all embodied. Each of us here are sitting with our butts on a chair somewhere, our feet on the ground somewhere, and bringing that into the experience. So I'm really thrilled to be in this environment where people are seeing not a either or, it's this or it's demonized or it's idealized, but actually another way of being together. It's another space of being together. And I'm really intrigued by this idea of an extension, that it's an extension of ourselves. And certainly at some place that has opened up for me the whole realm of possibility and our imagination, not in the sense of making something up, but in the sense of making visible something that would otherwise be invisible. So I'm really intrigued by all of this. I really would like to look and see what's happening in your course. One of the things that when you were speaking and we were talking about temporality and the kind of, this is one of the big things that are often, the dangers of technology, and that we're losing our sense of being able of spaciousness, which is something I consciously bring into the realm of my work online. We were talking about that, and I was wondering if this kind of temporality that we're talking about is not limited to what we do online, but is in fact part of our modern life, the way modern life has evolved and developed, which technology is part of, but not the only part of. So I was intrigued there how you think about that, because at least when we were talking about it, seemed compartmentalized as this is the problem with technology. And I was wondering if that's how you feel about it, or if it's more nuanced.
That's a good question. I don't know, Richard, maybe you have something to say. I'm thinking.
Yeah, I'm thinking about that too. I mean, do you mean that the way we were talking about it in this little discussion felt like it got compartmentalized?
No, I mean, we were talking about it in relation to the way the critique of the online world and the way technology is affecting us as human beings, in the way that it's often referred to. But earlier in the conversation, we were talking about what happens online is not separate from the rest of us. It's part of our human psyche. And being online, I mean, in my experience, most people dismiss what's happening online as not real or somehow less valuable than. And a lot of my work is to bring people present online.
Yeah, but that's perhaps the issue is not, I mean, of course, there's one issue in thinking that the virtual reality is false or fake or a bad copy. Let's put that aside, because apart from that, yes, you're right. I mean, the way our culture, society is moving, of course, is paralleled in a way to what's happening but there's something about digitality that I think exacerbates that tendency in our society that we need to take account of, and that is that the speed, for instance, in which it's moving does not obey any more decisions made by human beings by algorithms. And so the algorithm is imposing universally the same temporality. Stiegler talks about these industrial temporal objects, and he refers to, reels and TikTok things and all these things that are, everyone's watching the same thing and it's all going at the same rhythm. And so suddenly we're all automatized. And so we lose our autonomy. And this has to do with how technology is being used in order to make money. So algorithms are very useful for that. But if you realize that's not the only use, then you're going to have to regulate how you use the algorithm and how. So you see, I mean, it does have to do with how society is moving, but it also is independent of it. If there is consciousness, if there's not consciousness, then we're just repeating the most unconscious parts of our psyche.
You were describing the need for discipline in this area, the need for some consciousness, for some awareness about how to work with this realm.
The fear is that the imposition of the technological on our culture, because of the way it's moving, might render us unable anymore to make decisions that really make a difference. And that's the real danger. And that's something that this man Stiegler dedicated his life to counteracting. And he really was quite pessimistic about the chances of our society not, moving away from that track in which it finds itself.
This is Bernard Stiegler, the French philosopher of technology who recently committed suicide, actually.
No, well, that's not quite, I mean, it's a rumor.
It's a rumor that he committed suicide. but wrote these amazing books. Automated Society, I think, is the one you're referring to now, right, Victor?
He was an activist as well. I mean, he really was very engaged in trying to change things in Europe. And most of his books give us a chronic of this. And it really, it sounded like every battle he fought was not very successful.
I think, can I interject something? Because I think you brought up something that's huge. I know for those of you who know Tom Singer, he's gone into this work. I asked him actually to bring it out in a conference we just did. When you talk about algorithms, Victor, and bringing it into the psychoanalytic, in a conversation with Tom, and he was already working on this, but I was asking him to go a little more deeply into exploring the way in which the algorithms feed us only what we're already predisposed to want to believe, see, and hear. So in one sense, the algorithms are reinforcing, if we want to be Jungian about it, they're reinforcing the complex. Because we're getting, unless we discipline ourselves to break out of that, but they're reinforcing complexes because they're giving us a steady diet of only what we're predisposed to agree with and to want to see and to want to hear.
Only because the algorithm is working towards attracting your attention for financial gain.
Yes. Yes. So it's not the digitality that's the issue. It's the way the digitality is being exploited.
It's the way in which the data that they're extracting from you, in terms of which they construct your profile, is geared not towards your flourishment, but rather
Mhm.
towards your spending and consuming.
Mhm.
Yeah.
That's the issue, I think. The algorithm in itself, I mean, technology is an extension of ourselves. So if there's unconsciousness in how we use it, it's going to be unconsciously used, right? And here there's this complete blindness about what technology is doing to us personally, because the only attention is given to how you can make use of it for profit. That it's terrible to, I mean, it sounds so simplistic, but it's really that terribly, profoundly dark what is happening.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, Jete, I don't know if I'm pronouncing your name
Yes,
correctly, so please
Jete.
let us know.
Yeah, it's
Okay.
yet to, it's fine. I think
Jete.
what's also really interesting to think about is like what an algorithm picks up, right? Like when are people engaging with the algorithm? I almost feel like I tell my clients always, we need couples therapy for you and your algorithm, because it's such a functional and, you know, transactional relationship. But the algorithm, a lot of people tell me, oh, my algorithm knows who I am. I'm like, absolutely not. First of all, I don't know who you are as a therapist. You don't know who you are. Your algorithm knows what you do at night when you're really depressed and feel lonely and feel disconnected and you have you're sleep deprived. And this is the data that is then collected and harvested. And you are made to believe now that you have this relationship with an algorithm that knows you. I mean, this in itself is I think really cool to explore. You know, it's like, what is the data that's being harvested? And then why do we feel this is the data? You know, if I would tell my client, I'm like, I know exactly who you are. And, you know, so what you've told me, this is, you know, it's ridiculous if you think about it. So I also feel like we have this whole space of exploring our relationship with algorithms and learning what it really is. And the cognitive function, we're just like in the thinking function, which is like, can be such a boring place after all, right? So we're just like maneuvering around. And if a client comes to me, I'm not going to sit in the thinking function with them all session, right? I'm trying to use all the senses they have available and the imagination and all such. You know, why would we attempt to have algorithmic thinking at all in our process? I think it's not really desirable. It can be great for medical research stuff, and I'm all for it. But in the realm of psychology, I think it's very limited what an algorithm can do. If you ever had a chatbot encounter and tried to have a chatbot, you know, therapy with you, it's a very interesting experience. You feel like you're just kind of growing this poor little weak chatbot thing that has no clue about nothing, you know, and you're putting a lot of more effort into them than they are into you. I don't know. Sorry, I could go on forever.
And that's very, but it's very nice what you're saying, because in a way, I think what you're talking about is our transference to the algorithm, that we all form these transferences. And in some way, if you think about a concept of Lacan's, like the object's supposed to know, or the analyst's supposed to know, we impute that into the algorithm in terms of them knowing us in this kind of fantasied or imaginary way, in the negative use of that term. And that is an interesting thing to open up and explore. What the fantasy is that? What's the fantasy of the algorithm knowing you better than you know yourself?
Yeah, it's like I've been seen and understood and heard and all these things, right? But I'm not really.
Right, exactly, right.
Let me just recommend a TV series that just appeared. It's called, what's it called? Marjorie Prime, which is about these holographic people, algorithms. They're really algorithms that are used in order for people to deal with death
and loss. Yeah,
loss. Yeah. And it's very interesting because it shows you a different way of understanding what the algorithm can, how that can work as well.
Or the complexities of it, I would say.
All right.
Yeah, it's very interesting.
Anything around grief, I think we need a lot of help in the Western world. So I take the algorithm over nothing.
Yeah.
I think you just gave us, though, the quote for this entire evening, which is couples therapy for you and your algorithm. I think that's a classic. I think you've won the award, Jette, for the night with that one. Thank you.
This is very good.
So Richard and Victor, thank you. This has just been a joy. And congratulations again on a well-deserved Gradiva Award. And thank you so much for the work you're putting in the world. I love that it has come from a 30-year friendship. makes it even more, I think, poignant. And so for those of you who are on live, for those of you, many of you who will be watching this as a recording, Richard and Victor will be offering this as a 3-week series. So you will get to spend, are you doing 60-minute sessions or 90-minute? I'm not sure. I think
90-minute.
90-minute. Okay, so 90-minute sessions, 3 90-minute sessions beginning in January. You will all be getting an email. We'll send you an email, so watch your inbox, but you can go to our website, pacifica.retreat.edu, and you will find their course listed on there with all the wonderful details. So you can feel free to register. And if you're on with us live tonight, actually, I'm almost forgot. If you're on with us live tonight, you get a 15% discount just for being on live with us tonight. So feel free to take advantage of that. We'll be emailing you the code. Again, everyone, thank you for this great conversation. Thank you, Richard and Victor. And I look forward to being in the series with everyone else. So wherever you are this afternoon or this evening, may you go in peace, and thank you so much for joining us.
Yep.
Goodbye, everyone.
Okay.
Thank
Cheers.
you. Bye.
Cheers. Cheers.
Cheers.
Thank you.